Like any other Tuesday afternoon, a young boy sat at his kitchen table, staring at his math homework with tears welling up in his eyes. The apartment was quiet except for the gentle hum of the old refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic from the busy Seattle streets below. The warm autumn sunlight streamed through the window, highlighting the scattered erasers and pencil shavings that told the story of his struggle. Living in a small two-bedroom apartment above his parents' convenience store, the boy spent most afternoons alone while his mom and dad worked tirelessly downstairs. The apartment wasn't fancy. The wallpaper was peeling in corners, and some of the kitchen cabinet doors didn't quite close right. But it was home. The walls were covered with family photos and his old drawings, bringing warmth to the modest space. His parents had moved from China 10 years ago, carrying nothing but 2 suitcases and big dreams for their future child. Now they owned a small store that served the neighborhood, working from sunrise to well past sunset. Their son would often hear his mother say, "Education is the key to a better life." But right now, that key felt more like a heavy weight on his 12-year-old shoulders. The math problems in front of him seemed to dance mockingly on the page. Division signs looked like tiny smirking faces, and multiplication tables felt like an endless maze with no exit. His last math test had come back with a big red D on top, and he could still remember how his teacher had sighed during parent-teacher meetings, saying he was below average in mathematics. Every day after school, he would sit at this same spot, trying to make sense of numbers that seemed to speak a language he couldn't understand. The convenience store's bell would ring downstairs as customers came and went, and he could hear his parents' cheerful greetings floating up through the thin floors. Sometimes he'd sneak downstairs just to watch them work, his dad skillfully calculating discounts in his head for the regular customers, his mom quickly counting inventory without even using a calculator. The boy would help out on weekends, arranging candy bars in neat rows and making sure the drink coolers were perfectly organized. He didn't realize it then, but even these simple tasks were teaching him about patterns, counting, and spatial arrangement, the very basics of mathematics that would one day change his life completely. That particular Tuesday seemed just like any other, but life has a funny way of changing when we least expect it. As he struggled with his fractions worksheet, the autumn wind rattled the windows, and dark clouds began gathering in the sky. He had no way of knowing that in just a few hours, a chance encounter in Jefferson Park would set him on a path that would transform him from a struggling student into someone extraordinary. Looking at the clock, he realized it was almost 4 in the afternoon. Soon he would need to take his usual shortcut through the park to reach his weekly tutoring session at the library. The forecast had mentioned rain, so he grabbed his red raincoat, the one with a slight tear in the pocket that his mom had carefully sewn back together. As he packed his backpack, he could never have imagined that this ordinary Tuesday would become the most important day of his life. He tucked his unfinished math homework into his folder, promising himself he'd try again later. Maybe tomorrow would be the day when numbers finally started making sense. Little did he know, tomorrow would bring much more than just mathematical understanding. It would bring an adventure that would change not only his life, but the lives of countless others. The story was just beginning, and as he headed down the creaky stairs of his apartment building, the first drops of rain began to fall on the Seattle sidewalks. Sometimes, the greatest stories start on the most ordinary of days, and sometimes the most remarkable discoveries happen to the most unexpected people. The rain was coming down harder now, as the boy hurried through Jefferson Park, clutching his backpack close to his chest to keep his homework dry. The usual shortcut through the park felt different today. The autumn rain had turned everything into shades of deep green and gray, and the normally busy playground stood empty and quiet. He was about to rush past the playground when he heard something unusual over the patter of raindrops. At first, he thought it might be a cat seeking shelter, but as he listened more carefully, he realized it was the sound of someone crying. The sound was coming from beneath the large spiral slide, barely visible through the curtain of rain. Most kids his age would have probably kept walking. After all, he was already running late for his tutoring session, and the rain was getting heavier by the minute. But something made him stop. Maybe it was because he knew what it felt like to be alone and scared, or maybe it was simply because his parents had always taught him to help others in need. Cautiously, he approached the slide. Huddled underneath, he found a small girl, probably no more than 6 years old. She wore a beautiful blue dress that looked completely out of place in the rainy park, now slightly muddy at the edges. Her hair was neatly done in 2 braids, though they were starting to come undone in the damp weather. She looked up at him with tear-filled eyes, hiccuping slightly from crying. "Hey there," he said softly, crouching down to her level. "Are you okay?" The girl shook her head, fresh tears filling down her cheeks. She was clutching a small stuffed rabbit that looked expensive, the kind his parents could never afford to buy him from the fancy toy store downtown. "I can't find my way back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was with my nanny, and I saw a butterfly, and I followed it, and now I don't know where I am." She spoke with a slight accent that reminded him of his cousins who had visited from Shanghai last summer. Despite his own shyness, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. This was something he could handle. Hadn't he learned the entire neighborhood inside and out during his daily walks to and from school? He knew every shortcut, every landmark, every crossing. "Don't worry," he said, offering her his hand. "I know this park really well. Can you tell me what you remember seeing before you got lost?" He pulled out his slightly crumpled math notebook, the same one filled with wrong answers, and turned to a blank page. Sometimes, when numbers didn't make sense, drawing pictures did. As the girl described her journey, he sketched a rough map. She remembered a coffee shop with a green sign, a flower store with yellow roses in the window, and a street musician playing a violin. With each detail, a pattern started emerging in his mind, like connecting dots on a grid, something he'd never been able to do with his math problems. The rain had eased to a gentle drizzle now, and the boy found himself doing something he'd never done before, solving a real-life puzzle. Each landmark the girl mentioned was like a point on a coordinate plane, only this time it made perfect sense. He wasn't just memorizing formulas from a textbook. He was using spatial reasoning to solve an actual problem. Together, they stepped out from under the slide, the girl still holding his hand tightly. Her small stuffed rabbit was tucked safely under her other arm, slightly damp but otherwise unharmed. The boy had missed his tutoring session by now, but somehow that didn't seem important anymore. Right now, what mattered was helping this lost child find her way back home. Little did he know that this simple act of kindness, this practical application of problem-solving, would open a door to a world he never imagined could exist. Sometimes the best lessons don't come from textbooks or classrooms, but from real-life moments when we least expect them. And on this rainy afternoon in Jefferson Park, a struggling math student was about to stumble upon something that would change his life forever. Standing in the drizzling rain, the boy looked at his makeshift map again. His math notebook pages were getting slightly damp, but the pencil marks still showed clearly where he'd marked each landmark the little girl had mentioned. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was really using his brain in a way that made sense. "Okay," he said gently to the girl, who had stopped crying but still held his hand tightly. "Let's think about this like a puzzle. You said you saw the coffee shop with the green sign first, right?" She nodded, clutching her stuffed rabbit closer. "And then the flower shop with yellow roses." Another nod. Without realizing it, the boy was doing something remarkable. He was creating a timeline, plotting points, and calculating distances, all the things that had seemed impossible in his math class. But here, in the real world, with a real problem to solve, everything felt different. He remembered how his dad arranged products in the store, always saying, "Everything has a logical order." His father would explain how customers usually walk through the store, following a natural path. Now the boy was applying the same principle to their search, thinking about how a 6-year-old girl might have wandered while following a butterfly. They started walking, the boy carefully leading them along the path he'd figured out. The girl's expensive shoes weren't made for puddles, so he helped her hop over them, making a game of it to keep her spirits up. "Look," he would say, "it's like we're exploring a new world, but we have a magic map to guide us." As they walked, he noticed something fascinating. The distance between each landmark the girl remembered got shorter and shorter. It made sense. She would have gotten tired as she walked further, taking shorter steps. This was just like those word problems he struggled with in math class, about speed and distance, but now it felt real and important. The violin music she'd mentioned hearing was a big clue. The boy knew there was only one street musician who played violin in this neighborhood, an old man who always set up near the fancy shopping district. If she'd heard the violin, they must be getting close to where her nanny would be looking for her. Every few minutes, he would stop and check his notes, adding new details as the girl remembered them. "There was a big red car," she'd say, or "I remember a statue of a man on a horse." Each new piece of information was like adding another number to an equation, making the solution clearer. He thought about his mother, who could count inventory so quickly because she grouped things together. Using the same idea, he grouped the girl's memories into areas of the neighborhood: the coffee shop district, the fancy shopping area, the park zone. It all started forming a clear pattern in his mind. The rain had almost stopped now, leaving behind that fresh, clean smell that comes after a storm. They were getting closer. He could feel it. The shops were getting fancier, the cars parked along the street more expensive. This was the part of town where his parents could only window shop, where everything in the stores cost more than their weekly earnings. Suddenly, they heard something over the quiet aftermath of the rain. Voices calling out, searching. The girl's face lit up like sunshine breaking through clouds. "That's my nanny," she exclaimed, bouncing on her toes. The boy felt a surge of pride. He'd done it. He'd solved the puzzle. But what he didn't know yet was that this success wasn't just about finding a lost child. Without realizing it, he'd shown himself and others something incredible, that inside his struggling student's mind was the brain of a natural problem solver. He'd used math in ways his teachers had never thought to show him, turning a real-world problem into a solution through pure instinct and logic. As they hurried toward the voices, the boy clutched his damp notebook, filled with its scribbled maps and notes. For the first time in his life, the pages of his notebook held something he was proud of. Not just wrong answers and red marks, but a real solution to a real problem. Little did he know, this rain-soaked notebook would soon become the first page in an extraordinary new chapter of his life. The shouts grew louder as they rounded the corner of an expensive boutique. Ahead of them, a group of people stood clustered under the awning of a high-end coffee shop. The little girl's face broke into the biggest smile he'd seen yet, and she started pulling him forward with newfound energy. A woman in a neat uniform, the nanny, spotted them first. Her worried face transformed into pure relief as she rushed forward through puddles, not caring about her polished shoes. "Oh, thank goodness, thank goodness," she cried out, dropping to her knees to embrace the little girl. The boy stood awkwardly to the side, suddenly very aware of his worn sneakers and rain-dampened clothes. But before he could slip away quietly, a tall man in an expensive suit stepped forward. The boy had seen people like him before, walking past his parents' store without ever glancing inside. But this man was different. His eyes were kind and filled with tears as he looked at the little girl, then at the boy who had brought her back. "You found my daughter," the man said softly, his voice thick with emotion. The boy noticed he had the same slight accent as the little girl. He wanted to say something clever or grown-up, but all he could do was nod and clutch his soggy notebook tighter. "How did you do it?" the man asked, genuinely curious. "We've had people searching for over an hour." The boy hesitated, then opened his notebook to show the simple maps and calculations he'd made. The pages were wrinkled from the rain, but his working out was still visible. All the landmarks, the distances, the pattern he'd figured out. The man studied the notebook with growing interest. His eyebrows rose as he flipped through the pages, looking at the way the boy had mapped out their search. "This is remarkable," he said, pointing to one of the diagrams. "You created a search grid based on probabilistic movement patterns. Did someone teach you this method?" The boy blinked in confusion. He hadn't created anything fancy. He'd just drawn what made sense to him, the way his parents organized their store inventory. I just thought about where she might have gone," he explained, "like how customers move through my parents' store." The man's eyes lit up with understanding and something else. Recognition, perhaps, of something familiar. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. It was printed on thick, creamy paper that seemed to repel the raindrops. "I'm the founder of Quantum Tech Solutions," he said, "but before that, I was a professor of mathematics. What you did here," he gestured to the notebook, "this is pure applied mathematics. Natural problem solving at its finest." The boy stared at the card, not quite understanding. The little girl tugged at her father's sleeve, still holding her stuffed rabbit. "Daddy, he made the scary go away," she said simply. "He made it like a game, finding our way back." A sleek black car pulled up beside them, and a driver stepped out with an umbrella. The man looked at his daughter, then back at the boy. "Would you tell me where your parents' store is?" he asked. "I'd like to thank them properly for raising such a thoughtful young man." There was something in his voice that suggested he had more in mind than just saying thank you. As the boy gave directions to his family's small convenience store, he had no idea that this moment, standing in the rain with his messy notebook and worn sneakers, would be the turning point of his life. He didn't know that this successful businessman would see past his struggling grades and recognize something special in the way his mind worked. The man helped his daughter into the car, then turned back one last time. "Sometimes," he said, "the greatest mathematical minds don't see numbers the way others do. They see patterns, solutions, and possibilities that others miss." He smiled warmly. "I'll be visiting your parents' store very soon. I think we have a lot to talk about." As the boy watched the expensive car drive away, the rain finally stopped completely. A rainbow appeared over the city buildings, and for the first time in his life, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't bad at math after all. Maybe he just saw it differently than everyone else. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing after all. The convenience store door chimed early the next morning, just like it had thousands of times before. But this time was different. The boy's father looked up from restocking the candy shelves and froze. There, in his modest store, stood the well-dressed businessman from yesterday, holding a sleek leather briefcase. "Good morning," the man said warmly, looking around the small store with genuine interest. "You have a wonderful shop here." The boy's father quickly straightened his apron, not used to having such an important-looking customer. The boy watched from behind the counter, where he'd been helping his mother count the morning's change. What happened next was like something from a dream. The businessman bought a coffee, the cheap kind they sold for $1, and sat down at the small plastic table by the window, the one where elderly neighbors sometimes rested with their groceries. He spent the next hour watching how the family worked together, particularly how the boy helped with the store. "You know," the businessman said finally, "I noticed something interesting. Your son doesn't just stock shelves. He creates systems." He pointed to how the boy had arranged the new delivery of snacks, grouping them by type, size, and popularity, making them easy for customers to find. The boy's parents exchanged glances. They'd always known their son was special, even if his teachers didn't see it. The businessman opened his briefcase and pulled out the boy's rain-soaked notebook from yesterday. "Yesterday, your son used the same kind of thinking to find my daughter. He sees patterns that others miss. He understands space and organization in a way that many trained mathematicians would envy." The boy's mother wiped her hands on her apron, looking proud but confused. "But his math grades," she began. The businessman shook his head, smiling. "Grades don't always tell the whole story," he said. "Sometimes the most brilliant minds just need a different way of seeing things." Over the next few weeks, the businessman, who insisted they call him Uncle in the Chinese tradition, became a regular visitor to the store. He'd bring puzzles and real-world problems, showing the boy how the same skills he used in the store could solve complex mathematical equations. One day, he brought a box of inventory from his company. "Let's say we need to organize these computer parts," he said. "How would you do it?" The boy arranged them just like he did the store's snacks, naturally creating an organizational system that, unknown to him, was actually an advanced sorting algorithm. The lessons never felt like school. They were more like games, puzzles that made sense. When the boy struggled with fractions, Uncle showed him how to use the store's pricing system to understand them. Percentages became clear through calculating discounts. Geometry came alive while organizing shelf spaces. Other days, they'd sit at that same plastic table, drinking dollar coffee, while Uncle explained how the boy's way of finding his daughter was actually advanced spatial mathematics. He showed how the same principles helped computers solve problems, design buildings, and even explore space. The boy's parents watched this transformation with joy and amazement. Their son, who used to cry over math homework, now rushed to solve problems. His eyes lit up when Uncle arrived, eager to learn more. The store became more than just a shop. It became a classroom where real-world math came alive. Even the regular customers noticed the change. They'd smile seeing the boy and the successful businessman huddled over notebooks and puzzles, speaking the universal language of numbers. Some even started bringing their own children to the store, hoping some of that mathematical magic might rub off on them too. One evening, as Uncle was leaving, he paused at the door. "You know," he said to the boy's parents, "your son reminded me of why I fell in love with mathematics in the first place. It's not about memorizing formulas. It's about seeing the patterns in the world around us. And your son, he has a gift for seeing those patterns." The boy, arranging cans on a shelf nearby, smiled to himself. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like the kid who was bad at math. Instead, he felt like someone who had a secret superpower, the ability to see the mathematics hidden in everyday life. The change didn't happen overnight, but it was remarkable all the same. One sunny morning, about 3 months after Uncle's first visit, the boy sat in his math class, staring at a problem on the whiteboard that would have terrified him before. But now, something was different. The numbers weren't just meaningless symbols anymore. They were like old friends. The problem was about a delivery truck needing to calculate the most efficient route to deliver packages. While other students groaned and reached for their calculators, the boy smiled. This was just like helping his dad plan the most efficient way to restock shelves, or like finding that lost little girl in the park. He could see it all in his head. His hand shot up, surprising even himself. The teacher, who was used to his silence, called on him with raised eyebrows. As the boy walked to the board, he remembered Uncle's words. "Don't just solve it, explain how you see it." So he did. He drew a simple map, just like he had in his rain-soaked notebook months ago, and showed how the truck's problem was really a puzzle about patterns and efficiency. The class watched in stunned silence. This was the same boy who had failed almost every math test last semester. Even the teacher leaned forward, intrigued by his unusual but perfect solution. That's exactly right," she said, "but I've never seen anyone solve it quite that way before." After class, she asked him to stay behind. The boy worried he'd done something wrong, but instead, she wanted to know more about how his mind worked. He told her about Uncle's visits, about learning math through the store's inventory, about seeing numbers as patterns rather than just figures on a page. That conversation changed everything at school. His teacher began incorporating real-world examples into her lessons, and suddenly, other struggling students started to understand too. The boy found himself helping classmates, showing them how to see math in the world around them, just as Uncle had shown him. At home, the family store became a kind of unofficial math club. Uncle would bring interesting problems from his tech company, and the boy would solve them using items from the shelves. Want to understand probability? Let's look at which candy bars sell fastest. Need to learn about ratios. Let's mix different flavors of slushy drinks to create new combinations. Other kids started dropping by after school, not just to buy snacks, but to see math in action. The boy's parents had to add another small table by the window to accommodate all the impromptu study sessions. His mother would serve hot tea and smile, remembering how her son used to hide his math tests at the bottom of his backpack. One day, Uncle brought a special guest to the store, his daughter, the same little girl from the park. She was carrying a new math textbook and looked nervous. "Could you help me?" she asked shyly. "Daddy says you know how to make numbers feel like friends instead of scary monsters." As the boy helped her with her homework, using candy bars to explain addition and subtraction, he realized something amazing. He wasn't just learning math anymore. He was teaching it. And somehow, teaching others helped him understand even more deeply. His bedroom walls, once bare, now held colorful diagrams and patterns he'd discovered. His old math notebooks, filled with wrong answers and red marks, were replaced by new ones full of creative solutions and real-world applications. Even his dreams had changed. Instead of math nightmares, he now dreamed of new ways to solve problems. One evening, as he helped his father calculate the day's earnings, his dad paused and put a hand on his shoulder. "You know," he said quietly, "sometimes the best gifts come in disguise. We thought the store was just our family's living, but for you, it became something more. It became your classroom, your laboratory, your way of seeing the world." The boy nodded, understanding completely. Every aisle in their small store held a lesson in disguise. Every transaction was a puzzle waiting to be solved. Math wasn't just about numbers on a page. It was about patterns in life, hidden everywhere, waiting for someone who could see them. Spring arrived, bringing cherry blossoms and big news. The boy sat at the family's kitchen table, surrounded by his parents and uncle, staring at a letter that would change everything. He'd been invited to compete in the Regional Mathematics Championship, something that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. "But I've never been in a competition before," he whispered, his hand shaking slightly as he held the invitation. Uncle smiled that warm smile that had become so familiar. "Haven't you?" he asked. "What about solving the puzzle of finding my daughter? What about figuring out the most efficient way to stock your parents' store? You've been competing with real-world problems all along." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation, but not in the way most kids studied for math competitions. Instead of memorizing formulas, the boy spent time looking at how mathematics appeared in everyday life. He watched how water spiraled down drains, studied the patterns in flower petals, and observed how birds formed perfect V-shapes in flight. Uncle brought him problems from his tech company, real challenges that his engineers faced. The boy would solve them using items from the store, arranging candy bars to understand computer data storage, using drink cups to explain algorithms. What amazed everyone wasn't just that he could solve these problems, but how he could explain complex concepts in ways that anyone could understand. The morning of the competition arrived bright and clear. The convention center was packed with students from expensive private schools, all carrying advanced calculators and wearing matching team uniforms. The boy felt out of place in his simple clothes, carrying only his notebook and the lucky pencil his mother had given him. The first problem appeared on the screen, a complex logistics challenge about delivering packages across a city. While other contestants reached for their calculators, the boy closed his eyes and saw his neighborhood, the coffee shops, the parks, the busy streets. He remembered finding the lost little girl, mapping out the search pattern. The solution flowed naturally onto his paper. Problem after problem appeared, each one seemingly more difficult than the last. But for each one, the boy found a real-world connection. A question about probability became a puzzle about arranging store inventory. A geometry problem transformed into planning shelf spaces. Advanced calculus turned into calculating the most efficient way to serve customers during rush hour. During the lunch break, other competitors gathered around him, curious about his methods. "How did you solve the logistics problem?" they asked. Instead of explaining with formulas, he used their sandwich boxes and drink bottles to demonstrate, turning abstract mathematics into something they could see and touch. The judges were equally intrigued. They'd never seen someone approach problems quite this way before. While other students gave textbook answers, the boy provided solutions that could work in the real world. His explanations weren't just mathematical. They were practical, creative, and surprisingly simple. When the final results were announced, the convention center fell silent. The boy who once struggled with basic arithmetic had achieved the highest score in the competition's history. But what made the victory special wasn't just the score. It was how he'd gotten there. That evening, back at the small convenience store, there was a celebration unlike any other. Regular customers brought food, neighborhood kids hung congratulatory signs, and even some of his former competition rivals stopped by. The store that had been his first classroom was now filled with joy and pride. His mother hung his medal next to the family photos behind the counter. His father kept wiping tears from his eyes while restocking shelves. And Uncle? He stood quietly in the corner, watching with satisfaction as the boy explained complex mathematical concepts to younger kids using nothing but items from the store shelves. "You see," the boy told his young audience, arranging chocolate bars in a pattern, "math isn't just about numbers. It's about seeing the patterns in the world around us. It's about finding solutions in unexpected places." As he spoke, his eyes shone with the confidence of someone who had not just learned math, but had discovered a new way of seeing the world. Word spread quickly after the competition. Local newspapers ran stories about the convenience store boy who solved complex math problems using candy bars and shelf space. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't just his victory. It was his unique way of teaching others. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, a group of teachers from different schools visited the store. They watched in amazement as the boy helped a struggling student understand fractions by organizing packets of gum. "See," he explained, "if you have 3 packs here and 2 packs there, you're really working with 3/5. Math is just counting things we can touch and see." The store began to change. His parents cleared out a corner and added more tables. They put up a small whiteboard where the boy could draw his explanations. What started as occasional tutoring sessions grew into regular after-school groups. Kids who hated math began to look forward to these lessons, where numbers came alive through everyday objects. A local education magazine wrote an article about his teaching methods. "The Store School," they called it, describing how this young math prodigy was revolutionizing the way students thought about numbers. "He doesn't just teach math," one student was quoted saying. "He shows us how it's already part of our daily lives." University professors started dropping by to observe his methods. They were particularly interested in how he helped students who struggled with traditional teaching methods. The boy would use price tags to explain percentages, arrange fruit to demonstrate geometry, and create games with shopping baskets to teach probability. One day, a famous educational researcher visited. She spent hours watching him work with students, taking detailed notes. "What you're doing here," she said finally, "is exactly what modern education research suggests, learning through real-world applications, but you discovered it naturally, through your own experience." The researcher helped document his teaching methods. Together, they created simple guides that other teachers could use, showing how to turn everyday situations into math lessons. These guides began circulating among schools, helping other students see math in a new way. Uncle's tech company created educational software based on the boy's methods. The program used virtual store items and real-world scenarios to teach mathematical concepts. Soon, schools across the country were using this software, helping countless students who, like him, needed a different way to understand numbers. But the boy never forgot his roots. Even as his methods gained recognition, he kept teaching at the store every afternoon. He remembered how it felt to struggle with math, to feel lost and confused. Each time a student's eyes lit up with understanding, he felt the same joy he'd experienced when numbers first started making sense to him. His parents' store became a landmark of sorts. People would travel from other cities just to see this unique learning space. Some days, you'd find university students sitting next to elementary school kids, all learning math through everyday objects. The boy's mother kept everyone supplied with hot tea and encouragement, while his father beamed with pride as he restocked shelves. Education conferences invited him to speak, but he insisted on giving his presentations through video calls from the store. "This is where the magic happens," he'd say, showing how simple items from the shelves could explain complex mathematical concepts. Teachers around the country began creating their own versions of the store school, turning ordinary spaces into extraordinary classrooms. One evening, as he helped his father close up the store, they found a letter slipped under the door. It was from a student who had visited months ago. "Before I came to your store, I thought I was stupid because I couldn't understand math. But you showed me that I wasn't bad at math. I just needed to see it differently. Now I'm top of my class, and I help other kids the way you helped me." The boy pinned this letter next to his competition medal behind the counter. To him, this was an even greater achievement than winning any competition. He had not only found his own way to understand mathematics, he was helping others find their way too. 10 years passed like pages turning in a book. The small convenience store still stood on its corner, but now it had become something much more. The simple shop where a struggling student once discovered his gift had transformed into an internationally recognized learning center, though it still sold candy bars and everyday items just the same. The boy, now a young man, sat at one of the teaching tables, helping the group of students. His laptop showed complex quantum computing problems from Uncle's company, but he was explaining them using jelly beans and paper clips. Some things never changed. He still believed the best way to understand complex ideas was through simple, everyday objects. "See this arrangement?" he asked, moving the jelly beans around. "This is exactly how quantum computers store information. Each jelly bean represents a qubit." The students leaned forward, their eyes bright with understanding. Among them sat Uncle's daughter, now a teenager herself, taking notes for her advanced physics class. The store had grown, but carefully. The family had bought the empty shop next door, creating a proper learning space while keeping the original store intact. One side still served the neighborhood with groceries and daily necessities. The other side had become a free learning center, where students of all ages could discover the beauty of mathematics in their own way. Photographs lined the walls, telling their story. There was the old rain-soaked notebook from that fateful day in the park. The medal from his first competition hung next to pictures of students who had gone on to become engineers, teachers, and scientists. Each image told a story of transformation, of someone who had discovered their own way of seeing mathematics. The young man's parents still worked in the store, his mother still serving tea to students, his father still carefully arranging inventory. But now they also helped run educational programs, sharing their practical wisdom about how math exists in everyday business. Their simple store had sparked a revolution in teaching, showing that mathematics could be found everywhere, in everything. That morning, a special visitor arrived. A Nobel Prize-winning mathematician who had traveled across the country just to see this unique place. But instead of giving a lecture, the famous mathematician sat quietly, watching how students learned complex concepts through simple objects. "This," the mathematician said later, "is the future of education." Educational researchers had documented everything about the store's teaching methods. They called it the corner store approach, and it was being studied in universities worldwide. But the young man knew the real magic wasn't in any formal method. It was in helping each student find their own way of seeing patterns in the world. As evening approached, he walked through the store, straightening items on shelves, a habit he'd never lost. A small girl tugged at his sleeve. "Is it true?" she asked. "Were you really bad at math before?" He smiled, remembering his own struggles. "I was never bad at math," he replied. "I just needed to find my own way to understand it." And that's what we do here. We help people find their way. The next generation of students had already started teaching others. Some of his first students now ran similar programs in their own communities. The ripple effect had spread far beyond their small corner store, touching lives across the world. But he still kept his base here, in the place where it all began. Uncle, now retired from his tech company, but still sharp as ever, often dropped by to pose new challenges to the students. Remember, he would say, every problem has a solution. Sometimes we just need to look at it differently. The young man would smile, remembering that rainy day when a lost little girl helped him find his path. As the sun set outside the store windows, casting long shadows across the learning tables, the young man looked around at what their small family store had become. It wasn't just a place that sold groceries anymore. It was a beacon of hope, showing that everyone could understand mathematics if they found their own way to see it. He picked up a piece of chalk and wrote on the small blackboard behind the counter, "Mathematics is not about numbers. It's about seeing the patterns in everything around us." Below it, countless thank you notes from students covered the wall, each one a testament to the power of believing that everyone can learn, just in their own unique way.